Today on the We Invested podcast, we have Bernadette Joy, the founder and CEO of Crush Your Money Goals. Bernadette, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining. Before we started recording, I was just letting you know how much of an honor this is for me to have you on the podcast, because I've heard so much about you and got the chance to read your articles. So this is a really exciting moment for me.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And it's really nice to hear that someone's reading it out there. You never know who's listening. And so keep doing what you're doing as well.
Absolutely. And before we get started, would you just mind letting the people know how they can find you on the internet or social media?
Sure. So my company is called Crush Your Money Goals. You can find us at crushyourmoneygoals.com. We primarily focus on helping women reach financial independence. And then on social media, my two main platforms are LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can find me at Bernadette Joy.
Awesome. So let's just start from the beginning and talk a little bit about, where you're from and where you grew up.
Sure. So I'm originally born and raised in Queens, New York. And I lived there until college. Then I went to Boston University for undergrad. And then, unbeknownst to me, ended up marrying a guy from South Carolina, which I never thought I would do, being from New York City. And ended up moving to Charlotte, North Carolina. And that's where I have been for the last 10 years, minus 2 years in the pandemic. We took a little break and went to Asheville, North Carolina. I heard you're from North Carolina too. So we spent a little bit of the pandemic there before coming back to Charlotte.
That's incredible. And so, you growing up in New York, it's a huge melting pot full of culture and just different experiences. So I wanted to ask, how did growing up in New York impact your outlook on life and success?
Well, you know what? It's funny because a lot of New Yorkers, we like to brag that we're in that melting pot and that we're, exposed to so much diversity. But what I found in hindsight actually is that because there's so much diversity, you also see a lot of neighborhoods that kind of tend to stick to themselves, right? And so I grew up in a neighborhood that when I was living until I was about 10 years old, I was living in a neighborhood called Astoria. And back then it was really Greek. And I was one of a handful of kids who was not Greek in my school. I remember in our multicultural day, they had this thing where you would bring your picture to school and they would put the pictures underneath the countries where your family was from. And so we had all different countries, like, a lot of Latin American countries. But I just remember that the Greek poster was so big that it took up an entire wall at school. And when they had the poster for Filipino kids, it was maybe like 8 of us in total, right, in the whole school. And so I remember thinking that I was different somehow, but I wasn't sure what, like, as a child, you don't really think about those things.
Mhm.
And then we moved to another neighborhood called Bayside in Queens. And I remember going into my 4th grade class for the first time, really scared and nervous, and then going home and telling my parents, half of the kids are Asian, half of them look like me. And I was so bewildered because I'd never seen that many Asian kids before. But still, I was one of a very few Filipinos. It was mostly Korean and Chinese that went to my school. And so I was exposed to a lot of different cultures, was very grateful that I got to eat a lot of good food growing up and going to my friends' houses. But I also learned when I came to Charlotte that I learned a lot of different types of diversity in terms of like Southern, very different from growing up in New York City for sure. And also just being exposed to kind of different trains of thought, especially from the perspective of a lot of people move to Charlotte feeling like it's the big city here, right? And
Mhm.
for me, it felt like, okay, like this is like a big town, and that's why I moved here, because I was actually trying to get away from city life. And so it's also been really interesting to see how Charlotte has evolved in the last couple of years, especially, and it is turning into one of the bigger cities now.
Absolutely. So how was that transition for you from New York then to Boston and now to a city like Charlotte? Was it a huge culture shock for you?
It was a pretty big culture shock for me. So after I graduated from high school, I went to Boston University. I stayed there for several years after I graduated. So that's where I spent my young adult life. And Boston is a great city to be a young adult in, right? Everyone, like the average age of the city is like in their 20s. So it was a really cool place, but I don't miss the winter at all. And then I moved back to New York City, which informed a lot of probably what we'll talk about later about my perspectives around career and money and being able to be financially stable. I graduated in 2007. And I started my career as an HR professional in financial services in New York City. So we know what happened in 2008. And that was really an interesting time to start a career in HR. And so when I moved to Charlotte, the biggest culture shock for me was how much more work-life balance there is here versus in New York. I ended up taking an HR job to be the head of HR for a tech company here. And my boss, who was a CEO at the time, would tell me, like, why are you still, it would be like 5 o'clock and no one would be in the office. And he's like, why are you still here? Like, go home. And at first I thought, I was like, is everyone lazy? Like, what's happening here? And then I realized actually New York is kind of crazy. Like, New York is the crazy place where people work too much.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that's a great segue in, just talking about financial independence and learning more about becoming financially stable. I mentioned that the way I learned about you was through a coworker. They came and showed me your article and the amazing accomplishments and achievements that you've been able to accomplish. So I want to ask, what is Crush Your Money Goals?
Sure. So Crush Your Money Goals is the company I founded of all times in January of 2020. And the idea behind it was to teach financial education for underrepresented communities, and particularly to teach people how to become debt-free. That was the first iteration of it. And it was based off of my own experience. My husband and I are both first-generation Filipino Americans. We have not received any inheritances. I'm actually the eighth of my dad's 9 kids. And I would hear all this rhetoric of how it's possible for other people to be wealthy, but maybe not for us. And long story short, my husband and I, we started our financial independence journey in 2016. We started off with paying off $72,000 of student loan debt. And then we're like, you know what, let's see what else we can do here. We ended up paying off all of our debts, including our house. And by 34, I was a debt-free 34-year-old with a paid off home. And I was thinking, well, I don't think people understand that this is actually possible. And how can I teach other people to do the same thing? And so 2020, I started Crush Your Money Goals. And actually, the predecessor to Crush Your Money Goals was a podcast called Crush This Debt. And I really thought it was just going to be a one and done thing. I thought I would do 10 episodes. And I really, if I'm being honest, the only reason I did the podcast was because so many people asked me, how are you doing this? How did you pay off all this debt? And I said to my husband one day, it'd be really cool if instead of going out for all of these different coffee dates and people to pick my brain, to just like record my answer and send it to people. And he was like, that's called a podcast, right? I was like, oh, that's what I'll do then. So I started the podcast in 2018, and then it just kept growing from there. In 2020, I went full time into this career, and it's been growing ever since. And it's been the biggest joy and surprise of my life.
No, that's incredible. I mean, and you were able to pay off $300,000 worth of debt. I mean, which is a huge number for anyone. I mean, even $72,000 worth of debt in student loans is still a pretty big number. So what was that process like for you? Were you ever intimidated by these large dollar amounts?
I don't know if intimidated is the right word, but it was definitely, it definitely gave me a lot of ammo to think about how I want to do my life differently. So I remember specifically January of 2016, I was on my last semester of my MBA program. I had what I call my quarter life crisis, where I was like, I don't want to do HR anymore. Like, this thing is stressful. Like, corporate is stressful for me, and I don't know what my next move is. And so I did the thing that I thought would buy me some time, was like, you know what? Well, people won't think I'm a loser if I go back to school and get my MBA. So I went to get my MBA thinking that would help me figure out what I want to do next. And all that happened was that 2.5 years later, I still didn't know what I wanted to do, but now I had all this student loan debt. And I remember looking up how much I owed, because I had no idea how much it was. And I had basically a panic attack. I was just like, I can't believe I took out all of this debt and I have no game plan for my life. Plus now I have a mortgage on my house. I also thought I was going to be like an HGTV flipper. So I also got a mortgage on another house that I could not afford. And my husband at the time was just like, what are you freaking out about? Everybody has debt. Everyone we know has a mortgage, has student loans, has car payments. Like, this is normal. And I remember thinking, like, this can't be how life has to be the rest of my life. Like, I can't be stressing about money the rest of my life this way. And so I was like, if this is normal, then I don't really want it. So I started with just paying off the student loans. I thought it was going to take us 2 years, which still would have been crazy aggressive. But I was so heavily focused on it that we actually paid it off in less than a year. And once we did that, I started building a lot more confidence of like, well, what else can I do? And back then, I didn't know anything about investing. I didn't know anything about being able to like, grow a business in that way. And so I thought, well, you know what, like, I know what is for sure is that I want a home that I feel is mine and I can feel safe in. So I was like, let me just do that for now until I figure out my next thing is. And 3 years later, we paid off the house. And I remember thinking, wow, there are people I know who are twice my age who still are paying off their houses. And how much more freedom of choice do I have now? So 2020, after I paid off the house, I was like, you know what? Let's get a little ballsy here. Let's like see what we can do business wise. And that's when I launched Crush Your Money Goals, totally not knowing that the next thing was going to happen was a global pandemic.
Absolutely. And so how did you feel like that timing was for you when you're starting an online business and an education business, and then the pandemic hits? So now everyone has to be at home in their house and they cannot leave. How was that timing for you?
You know what? I would say it was pretty terrible for the world, obviously, for a lot of different reasons. But for me, I guess I wasn't as scared because I remember looking to my husband and saying, you know what? Imagine we were going into this pandemic and we still had the mortgage and we still had the student loan debt and we still had all these things that we had to worry about. And I remember, seeing a lot of my, friends and other people I knew that were closing their businesses or getting, having to look for new jobs or having to ask for forgiveness on, or forbearance on their mortgages. And so comparatively, I felt like, I'm actually not a religious person, but I thought, someone out there is looking out for me and gave me the foresight to say, you know what, it might help you somewhere down the line to not have all this debt hanging over your head. And so I took it as my, I would say like my sign from whoever it is that was watching out for me to say, you know what, like you've been gifted this debt freedom. Like, why don't you use this time and this energy and what you know to help as many people as you can? And so for the first 6 months of the pandemic, all I did was try to teach as many people as I could, like how to get your finances under control so that we could remove some of the panic that people had around money.
Were there any significant sacrifices that you had to make while you were in the process of paying off your debt?
What I'll say is, people ask me this question a lot in terms of sacrifices, and back then they felt like sacrifices. But in hindsight, they felt like such a small price to pay, comparatively to what I gained. So when I thought about like the things I had to give up, so I gave up a lot of the usual things that people talk about, right? Like I didn't eat out much. I didn't, like my husband and I went from 2 cars down to 1 car. If you've ever been to Charlotte, it is not a commutable city without a car, right? So we had to really figure out our schedules to make a 1-car situation work between the two of us. We foregoed a lot of, family vacations and things like that during that time. And I think the biggest sacrifice, honestly, it sounds super cliche, was our ego, okay. Having to go to people and say, you know what, we can't go to this trip or we can't do this thing because we're really focused on paying off our debt. And a lot of people, and I would say, especially in Asian cultures, like you don't tell people that you're in debt. You don't tell people you can't afford things. You just like pretend you can and figure it out later, right? And so it was a really big sacrifice to actually go to people and be honest with what our financial situation was. But in hindsight, after we paid off the house, a lot of those same people that we thought were going to kind of like judge us or maybe look down on us were the same people who turn around and congratulated us and were happy for us. And then we're asking us for advice on how to fix their finances. And, I never expected that, that was in 2016. And so 7 years now, we went from $300,000 in debt. So now my husband and I have a net worth of over $1 million. And that never would have happened if not for those small sacrifices. And now, honestly, like, we get to do pretty much whatever we want now. And so would I trade those 3 years of sacrifice for like the rest of our life to be able to have choice in what we do? I wouldn't make that trade. I would make that trade over and over and over again if I knew that this was going to be the result of it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's incredible. Congratulations on that, on reaching that amazing goal. So with the students that you help in the people's lives that you impact, what would you say is the biggest barrier for them to overcome? Is it typically a mental barrier that they have to break down, or what would you say that is?
I would say, since the majority of people that I teach are women, it is a mental barrier, but I think it's more deeply rooted in what we've been raised to believe, especially kind of living in a patriarchal society. What I learned, especially with my most recent crop of students, is it's not for lack of knowledge, it's not for lack of trying, it's not because they're not smart enough or they don't work hard enough, but those are all the things that they're telling themselves. I see so many women who are saying, oh, well, it's because I shop too much. It's because I'm not disciplined enough. It's because, I don't know enough. I'm not good at math. But those are all things that we are kind of told by the patriarchy that women are supposed to be. Oh, like women just shop too much and women aren't good at math and all these other things. And so there is a mental thing for women to get over, but it's been kind of, I tell everyone all the time, it's really not us. If I'm seeing the same rhetoric from women who are in Reno, Nevada, as I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, and right now I have students who are in London and Hawaii and Texas and Canada, and they're all saying similar things, how can it be that we're the ones that are messed up, right? I just don't believe that it can be us. All of us are the ones that are messed up, right? So I think the bigger barrier is really getting a sense of confidence that, like, you actually know what's best for you. And a lot of women get confused by the fact that there's all of this advice that actually was never made for us. And as kind of a prime example, I'll even share an example today, right? It was just something small, but I have a client who's in my boot camp right now, and she has a ton of student loan debt. She's really stressed out by it. She decided to make this really amazing leap of faith to quit her job, move to a new job, and start a completely different career. And she has a friend who has a wedding, a destination wedding that's going to cost thousands of dollars to go to, and she is afraid to tell this friend, like, I can't afford to do this right now, right? Even if I were to like DoorDash all this, like do all the things, right, and make this happen, it's just not feasible for me right now. And her biggest concern, as many of my clients concern, is like, what if people don't like us anymore? What if people like stop being our friends? What if people like think that we're less than, right? Those are the things that actually make finances so much harder. If it was purely math, then we would all be rich.
And that's a huge aspect to finance and investing, is the psychological piece and that behavioral piece, because it's anytime people are involved, things always become unpredictable. Like you said, math and numbers, they are always the same. They're always constant. Formulas and equations always come out to the same thing. But when you add people into the mix, the behavioral portion of it can tend to make things a little bit trickier. One question I want to ask is, you mentioned the boot camp that, you have this new batch of students and a new batch of clients in this boot camp. So can you talk a little bit more about your 60-day boot camps and the different classes and courses that you offer?
Yeah, so since 2020, I have done all sorts of classes to try to teach people as much as I could about finances. So I taught, how to manage your credit and how to pay down debt and how to start investing and how to buy a house in a responsible way. And then this year, I combined the best of all of the content that I've created over the last 3 years and condensed it down into a very reasonable 60-day program that people can go through to be able to start off their new money plans in a way that is way more simple and way less stressful than how we've been taught. And so the goal by the end of the 60 days is that anyone who comes through this program can feel like they can manage their money on their own, stop doubting themselves, and have a reasonable plan to be able to do every month that isn't going to require spreadsheets, isn't going to require a financial advisor. And I've seen amazing things happen. I just started the boot camp this year, and the first batch of women that's gone through it, I try to only do like 30-ish or so at a time, because I actually meet with every single student one-on-one to look at their money plans. And I can't tell you how many times that I've heard this past couple of months of just like, I feel so much more relieved now. Like, I feel like I can do this. Whereas they were coming in saying like, I don't know what I'm doing. And it's like, actually, you do know what you're doing. You kept doubting yourself, but also there were some things that people were consistently doing that was making it overcomplicated. Right. So it was like a common example. A lot of people come into my program because they have a significant amount of debt, whether it's like credit card debt or student loans or whatever. And they're like, oh, but everyone told me that if I'm not investing right now, I'm missing out. Right. Mm-hmm. And what I explain to a lot of my students is just like, you will get there on investing. Right. But investing is like a marathon. It's something you're never going to stop doing once you start. Right. But if you start running a marathon and you don't have the foundations, you're trying to run before you know how to walk, then you're never really going to finish that marathon. And so finish the things that actually need to be finished before you start investing, like build your emergency fund and like get your credit card debt under order and like have a budget every month. And then you can be ready to go do some of the more complicated stuff. And almost every person that I've met in this program has been overcomplicating, trying to do too many things at one time. So it's been really nice to see people come out of this with a much more streamlined approach that's going to be a lot less overwhelming.
Absolutely. So what would you say are some of the money tools that you've utilized and that have been the most impactful for you in your personal journey?
So I would say number one is I recommend everyone to have a tool that helps you track your net worth in real time. I happen to use a tool called Mint, but there's plenty of other tools that are out there. I specifically chose Mint because even if I don't exist anymore, I actually thought about building my own version of it. But I was like, you know what? Intuit, the company that owns Mint, probably not going to go out of business anytime soon because they also own TurboTax, which does all of our taxes. So I wanted to find a tool that would be free for people and that they'd be able to access at any time, anywhere. I also teach everyone how to do a budget, but not like with complicated spreadsheets and stuff. And I went through a lot of different tools, and the tool that I found to be easiest was a tool called EveryDollar. And that's what I use to teach my clients how to do basic budgeting. And then the tool that I actually doesn't sound like a tool, but the tool that everyone seems to have been sleeping on is just high yield savings accounts right now. Like, it's so basic. But the vast majority of people who've come through my program haven't had a high yield savings account or never heard of it, and have been letting money sit in these accounts and are making zero interest. And so almost every person that's come through the boot camp, like, they've already kind of made their money back just by learning to shift their stuff over into a high yield savings account. All simple stuff, simple and accessible to anybody.
But it's extremely practical. And like you said, a lot of people do not know about it, but I personally love a high yield savings account. Synchrony Bank is one of my favorites and one I typically tend to use. But something that I want to highlight, and I think is extremely difficult to do, is making the transition from having a 9-to-5 job, you're working in HR and finance, to then deciding to start your own company, build your own brand, build your own business. How was that transition period for you? And what was that mental process like for you in deciding to make that decision and to make that jump?
I would say the initial jump wasn't as hard as I would have thought it had been, because probably because I disliked my job so much that I didn't feel like I was missing out on too much. But it was definitely hard to get to, not have benefits and like the steady paycheck and like figure out what that next move is going to look like. But funny enough, before Crush Your Money Goals, I had started a different business when I decided to leave my day job. So the first leap that I took was going into a retail business. There's a company called Dress where I would do like dress rentals.
Mm-hmm.
And what was actually harder was closing that business. And then starting a second business, because that was the business that I left my day job for. And I had so much ego about, oh my gosh, now I'm going to tell people that I couldn't figure it out and I didn't make it. And what was interesting was like, by all kind of vanity metrics, it looked like I was like successful. Like I was in a lot of like local television and like getting a lot of press, and I did have a lot of clients, and I was actually profitable at that business. But there came a point in 2019 when I decided to close it, that I realized that this wasn't the business that I wanted to spend the rest of my life on. It was a good way for me to learn business. So I learned a lot of really good things. I learned how to market. I learned social media. I learned how to handle clients. I learned how to write contracts. I learned how to do finances for a business. I was able to run a retail business with no debt, which is kind of unheard of, right, in retail. And so I learned a lot of really good things. And then the harder part was letting people know that I decided to close that business and do something different. And I spent all of basically the holiday season in 2019, like wrapped up underneath a weighted blanket and just like being like, what am I doing? Like, I can't believe that I left my day job to start this business just to close it, to start another business. Like, am I crazy? And the short answer, the silver lining on it is that since 2020, this business for me has, grossed like over, we're about to hit, $500,000 this month. And I get to do work that I really love. And I get to meet people from all over the world and actually feel like I'm helping people beyond just like helping them get dressed for an event. I look back and I said, wow, imagine I had not made that leap and I was still doing that. I think my life would be very different now.
At this point in your career, how do you define success?
I think the biggest indicator of success is how much control you have over your time and how much free time you have. A lot of people would look by kind of the measures of what I've accomplished. Like even you said, I saw you you're in this publication and you have this amount of money and you have this business, but none of this would really be successful if my mental health was in shambles and if I felt like I had to work all the time. So right now, my biggest measure of success, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, is that not that I plan to, but I could choose to walk away from this business right now, and I think I would still be okay. And I think I would still feel good as a person about the work that I've done. And I don't have my identity wrapped up in it. So even though Bernadette Joy is this person in Crush Your Money Goals, if all of this were to end tomorrow, I would be like, you know what, that was pretty amazing. And unfortunately, when I see a lot of people who are starting businesses or growing businesses, their identities get so much wrapped up in what they do for a living that even if you made all the money in the world, like it's so hard to walk away from that. And so for me, I've been really cognizant about trying to limit myself to 20 hours a week on working. Nice. And spending some time doing other things that I love to do. And so I've been getting a lot of commentary lately. Like I'll say this, I'm very proud of the fact just this past Friday, I did my first stand-up comedy set. First and last one, probably.
Oh, that's fire.
Yeah. I was
fire.
Terrified. It was harder than walking away from my job or anything like that. Was really something that was scary for me. But I had, I had the free time to take a class for 6 weeks and to write all these jokes and to like practice. Yeah. And if I'd been working a full-time job, I don't think I would have ever done that.
That's fire. This is so random. Yo, this is incredible though, because I love stand-up comedy. So this has nothing to do with what we've been talking about, but I want to ask, like, who are some of your comedic inspirations? Like, what got you started in that? That's like super cool.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think it does actually have a lot to do with this because, growing up, being Asian American, I haven't had a lot of role models, right, who were famous. And, the only kind of famous people that I saw who were Filipino were Lea Salonga, who was a Broadway actress. She was the voice of Jasmine. That's in Aladdin. That's what people would know her for. And then like people in like So You Think You Can Dance, like that's pretty much it. And then recently there's just I don't know if you know Joe Coy, but he's like really popular now. And he's actually going to be in Charlotte this week, and I'm excited to go watch him. But he's been at this, he's like 50 something and he's just blowing up now, and I saw an interview of him recently where he was just like, people think I've been overnight success, but I've been at this for like 25 years at this point, right? So it's actually very motivating for me in my business, because sometimes, especially in the startup world, you see it's like, oh, this person's like 25 and they like have this multi-million-dollar business, and you're like, oh my gosh, like I'm not 25, am I so far behind? But then you look at someone like Joe Coy, and he's like literally selling out Madison Square Garden as a stand-up comedian. And you're thinking, okay, well, if he can do that, I think I can try. I can at least try what I'm doing.
Absolutely not. I saw Joe Coy 4 years ago live in Seattle. And I used to watch him maybe about 15 years ago on Comedy Central Presents, man. So I love stand up. But I think that's so awesome, like, that you had the courage and bravery to do that, because it takes a lot to show the world that side of you. So I mean, I really think that's incredible.
Thank you. Well, I'll also say that stand-up comedy, I would highly recommend for anyone who's an entrepreneur to take an improv class or take a stand-up comedy class, because like you'll get knocked down a peg or two in a good way. It'll show you like humility in a different way. And the biggest takeaway I took from both improv and stand-up comedy was, like to be in the present, like to focus on the present moment. Don't like think so far ahead, and don't like worry about what other people are thinking. Just focus on what you're doing right now, which has been hugely helpful for my business. And also just the economy of words. I've become a better writer and a better content creator because of what I learned in writing stand-up comedy.
Absolutely, man. I listen to a lot of Joe Rogan, and some of my favorite interviews are when he talks to other comedians, and you get to learn like how they think and how they process things. But my final question is, what does the future of Crush Your Money Goals look like to you? What is your vision for the future for your company?
Yeah. I would say that I want to continue on this path of helping particularly women become financially independent. I have a new goal this year that I think feels really good to me, which when I first started Crush Your Money Goals, my goal was to help eliminate $1 million of debt from people's lives. And I had backed into that of, okay, if $1 million, that would be about $10,000 for 100 women. That seems like feasible, right? But in the 3 years, I've learned like, wow, we're capable of so much more. And so my goal for Crush Your Money Goals is to create $1 billion of new wealth in the hands of women. So that would be 1,000 millionaires. So until I have helped 1,000 women become millionaires, like I still have a long way to go.
Man, that's incredible. Bernadette, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for allowing us the chance to pick your brain and learn more about, your rich history, man, and all the cool things that you're into. I really enjoyed this conversation and talking with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Absolutely.